They told the black pilot to wait outside. Seconds later, she took control. The morning was still young when the uniform caught every passing glance. 4 gold stripes glimmered at the edges of the sleeves, signifying authority few ever achieved. Confidence followed in each measured step through the terminal, not loud but steady, earned after years of storms, landings in hostile terrain, and hours upon hours in the sky. The crew lounge door opened with a soft push. Inside, laughter dulled, conversations tapered, and the quietest shift in the air made clear what the stripes represented: someone who didn't belong, at least in their eyes. The stares didn't need words. They said enough. At the coffee station, hands moved with the ease of repetition: sugar, cream, stir. But every reflection caught in the polished steel stared back with a question. Will they let this moment stand? The question wasn't about skill that had been proven thousands of times across continents. The question was about acceptance. Conversations picked up again, though not without that lingering sense of scrutiny. A familiar dance, measured glances, whispers tucked just out of earshot, but not far enough to be ignored. Less than 1% of commercial pilots looked like this. Every statistic carried weight, but none heavier than being the one walking into the room. The briefing was set to begin at 5:30. Time was never the problem. Discipline and punctuality had been drilled long before this uniform belonged to a civilian fleet. The real concern was something else: the faint tension that lingered just beneath polite greetings. A handshake that gripped too loosely, a smile that never quite reached the eyes, a welcome that felt more like permission. Then came the voice. Firm, practiced, and stripped of warmth, it cut across the room with the same force as turbulence hitting a plane mid-climb. "Captain Carter, we need you to wait outside." 7 words, delivered with the authority of command, but with the undertone of dismissal. They landed heavy, not just because of what they meant, but because of where they were spoken, inside the very company that had hired, vetted, and tested with the utmost scrutiny. The same company that had granted full captain status was now pushing its newest leader to the margins on the very first day. Silence followed. All eyes turned toward the one being singled out. Some tried to hide curiosity with lowered gazes, others didn't bother. There was no explanation, no clarification, only the demand. A demand no one else in that room had ever been asked to obey. The hallway outside was colder than expected. It stretched wide, filled with the distant echoes of rolling suitcases and boarding calls. The walls, lined with framed photos of smiling captains from decades past, told their own story, faces alike, generation after generation. Not one of them resembled the person now standing outside, stripped of command before even beginning. The mind raced. Years of dedication, the endless drills, the flawless records, all dismissed in an instant. This wasn't a matter of experience, nor of safety. It was something far older, buried beneath uniforms and traditions, now rising to the surface in plain sight. What would come next was unclear. But one truth was certain: those 7 words weren't a temporary inconvenience. They were the spark to something that would shake an entire airline from the inside. And as footsteps approached from behind, carrying the weight of a decision already made, it became undeniable. This was no ordinary reassignment. This was the beginning of a battle no one had expected. Least of all, those who thought they could silence her with a hallway and a closed door. If you're watching this right now, don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you never miss stories that matter. And let us know in the comments what country you're watching from. We'd love to see where this community is growing. The hallways stretched quiet, but the silence carried weight. Weight born not only from this moment, but from every moment that had led here. Years of sacrifice and unrelenting discipline pressed against the memory like air thinning at altitude. The journey began at the Air Force Academy, where every day was a battle to prove worth in a place where very few looked like her. Graduation came at the top of the class, not because of privilege or favoritism, but because failure had never been an option. From the earliest days, one lesson had been driven deep into the core: you'll need to be twice as good to get half as far. It wasn't a mantra for inspiration, it was survival in a world that set different standards for different faces. Military service followed, with transports flown across dangerous skies. Afghanistan became both training ground and crucible. Missions were long, unforgiving, and filled with split-second choices that determined lives. There was no room for hesitation, no room for error, and yet, every time a plane landed safely, the doubt of others remained unchanged. To them, excellence was never proof enough. It was an anomaly, something they explained away with luck rather than skill. Even after leaving the military, stepping into commercial aviation brought its own battles. Passengers occasionally glanced up the moment she entered the cockpit, their smiles faltering, their whispers carried just loud enough to sting. Some asked flight attendants for another pilot, convinced safety depended on someone else in command. Every insult carried the same unspoken meaning: you don't belong here. And yet, every departure that touched down without incident was another strike against the prejudice stacked high against her. Through each trial, the words of her father returned, not as a burden, but as a reminder. He had worked double shifts, sacrificed comfort, and instilled resilience through truth rather than softness. Twice as good for half as far. It had been a warning, but also a challenge, to carry pride in breaking barriers, even when the toll was crushing. The industry numbers told their own story. Less than 1% of pilots in the country shared her identity. Fewer still wore 4 stripes. The math was damning, but the reality was worse. Being part of that fraction wasn't just lonely, it was dangerous. Every mistake, no matter how small, would be amplified into proof that she should never have been there in the first place. And so excellence became armor. Flight hours stacked into the tens of thousands. Weather systems, complex approaches, night landings, each mastered, each logged, each proof of competence. Yet now, standing outside that briefing room, competence had been dismissed without question. This wasn't hesitation over her ability. This wasn't an oversight in scheduling. This was deliberate. Memories pressed forward of subtle slights that had grown sharper over the years. Colleagues who praised her in public but undermined her in private. Interview panels where her qualifications were dissected with suspicion. Passengers who looked past her when she introduced herself as captain, their eyes searching for someone else, anyone else, to trust. The hallway felt longer with each thought, its framed portraits echoing the truth. The gatekeeping here wasn't new. It had been in place for decades, carried down from one generation of uniformed men to the next, and now it had found its newest target. The realization landed heavier than the words that sent her outside. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't caution. It was exclusion, intentional and sharpened by the knowledge that the person standing outside didn't fit their image of command. The silence broke as the door creaked open. A figure stepped into the hall, eyes darting before speaking in a hushed tone. Whatever explanation came next, one truth already hardened inside. The battle ahead would not be about skill, safety, or protocol. It would be about dismantling the very barriers that had been built to keep her waiting on the other side of the door. The door reopened with a suddenness that broke the stillness. Standing there was a man whose very presence seemed rehearsed, hair streaked with gray, uniform pressed to perfection, smile wide enough to appear friendly, but never touching the eyes. Captain Richard Whitmore. His reputation preceded him, though not for kindness. Known across the fleet, he had the air of someone who believed the role of captain wasn't earned, but inherited. "Welcome to Meridian," he said, extending a hand. The grip was firm but short, a gesture more symbolic than sincere. His tone carried politeness, but underneath was something harder, something dismissive. The kind of greeting that disguised resistance as courtesy. The briefing room buzzed with quiet order as officers shuffled paperwork and attendants took their seats. Whitmore moved easily, like he owned the space, drawing attention without asking for it. When the agenda began, he wasted little time in announcing what should have been impossible. "There's been a change of assignment," he said, voice steady, almost casual. "Captain Carter, you'll be reassigned for now. Captain Whitmore will take command of Flight 207. The words dropped like lead. Around the table, silence stretched thin. The co-pilot, James Chen, glanced up sharply before masking his reaction. Flight attendants exchanged uncertain looks, none daring to speak. The room had shifted again. The message was clear. Confusion tried to rise into protest, but years of discipline pressed it down. "May I ask why?" The question was steady, controlled, refusing to show the insult it carried. Whitmore barely looked up from the chart in front of him. Experience. San Francisco is a demanding approach. We'll ease you in with a lighter load first. The explanation rang hollow. The San Francisco approach was challenging, yes, but nothing unfamiliar. Records already showed more than 70 successful landings into that very airport, including under worse conditions. Every qualification had been scrutinized before the captain's stripes were granted. This wasn't about ability. The silence pressed tighter, every set of eyes waiting for a response. Pride burned, but dignity weighed heavier. There was nothing to gain in challenging Whitmore here, not in front of an entire crew already conditioned to fall in line. Papers were gathered, words swallowed, the uniform straightened once more. Stepping into the hallway again, the air felt colder. For the second time that morning, the command to wait outside wasn't just an order, it was a reminder. A reminder that acceptance here wasn't granted, only loaned. Moments later, footsteps followed. James Chen emerged, his expression tense, his voice lowered as he drew closer. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "this isn't how it's supposed to work. First flights aren't pulled like that. I've seen plenty of new captains. None of them were reassigned." The words carried the validation no one else would risk offering. "So why now?" James hesitated, his glance darting toward the closed door as though it might be listening. "Because they're targeting you. Everyone knows it, they just won't say it out loud." It wasn't anger that rose, but a steady current of resolve. Anger could burn fast and leave nothing. Resolve endured. Standing straighter, the weight of the stripes was adjusted again, worn like armor against the quiet hostility filling every corridor. "Where are they sending me?" James's jaw tightened. His eyes betrayed reluctance, as though speaking the answer might make it worse. Finally, he leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. "They're pairing you with Captain Wilson." The name alone was enough to strike. Wilson, the airline's most senior captain and the loudest opponent of diversifying the cockpit. His disdain for change was well known, his authority protected by years of tenure and connections in the upper ranks. James shook his head slightly. "He never wanted you here. If they want to push you out, he's the one they'll use." The hallway, once just quiet, now carried the weight of an unseen fight stretching far beyond this single assignment. This wasn't a setback. It was the first deliberate move in a game that would test every ounce of resolve. The jet stood at the gate, engines quiet, sunlight glinting off its polished body as if mocking the storm already brewing inside the cockpit. Captain Harold Wilson sat in the left seat, posture rigid, face set in a permanent scowl carved deep by years of unquestioned authority. Without looking up, he muttered, "Take the jump seat. Observe. You're here to learn how Meridian does things." The dismissal was sharp, not a greeting, not even acknowledgement of equal rank. Just an order meant to establish who held power and who didn't. From the start, Wilson's tone carried disdain. Every checklist item, every routine adjustment, every line of communication with air traffic control was narrated in exaggerated detail, as though speaking to a student on their first day of ground school. His words carried an edge, stripped of respect, soaked in condescension. "This is how we run through the before-start checklist. No shortcuts here," he said loudly, glancing sideways only to catch her reaction. The implication stung, less about procedures and more about who he believed couldn't be trusted with them. Each instruction doubled as insult. Where other captains collaborated with first officers, Wilson performed for an audience of one, making a show of every action as if teaching a child. The co-pilot, Peter Lawson, kept his head down, eyes darting nervously between the two captains. He didn't speak, but his silence was loud. Takeoff came, and Wilson held the yoke with practiced ease. The aircraft lifted clean into the sky, engines humming as the runway fell away beneath them. Yet the cockpit, usually a place of precision and calm, felt heavy with unspoken hostility. Wilson never once asked for input, never invited collaboration. He moved with an arrogance that suggested the flight was his alone. Hours passed in a haze of altitude changes and radio calls, each one accompanied by another jab. "Notice how we confirm altimeter settings? You'll want to remember that." Or, "Some pilots rush this step, that's why they don't last here." It was humiliation disguised as instruction. The kind designed to plant doubt, not only in the target, but in the silent witnesses around them. Approach into Seattle began under cloud cover. Radios crackled as the tower issued instructions. Wilson, locked in his rhythm, dialed a frequency, repeating it aloud with absolute certainty. Seattle approach, 124.75. The number hit wrong. Too familiar not to catch. A quick scan of the chart confirmed the truth. Seattle approach was not on that channel. He dialed the wrong frequency. Silence stretched a moment too long. Lawson hesitated, fear evident in his tightened jaw. Wilson pressed the transmit button, waiting for a reply that never came. The wrong channel left them blind, dangerously close to losing coordination with traffic in crowded airspace. The decision came swiftly. "Captain, Seattle is on 2835 today." The voice cut in steady, even, unshaken. "The chart confirms it." Wilson froze, shoulders tensed. His hand lingered on the radio as though resisting correction. Then, wordless, he turned back to the chart. The mistake glared back at him. Slowly, with visible reluctance, he adjusted the dial. A reply came instantly from Seattle approach, confirming vector instructions. The crisis passed, but the air inside the cockpit shifted. Wilson's jaw tightened, his voice clipped. Finally, he muttered, "You have a good eye." A pause, heavy and unwilling. "But don't get the wrong idea, chart. One catch doesn't make you meridian material. Not everyone fits here." The words carried more weight than any turbulence. It wasn't an admission of gratitude, it was a reminder. No matter the skill, no matter the experience, the walls of exclusion stood firm. The landing rolled smooth onto the runway, tires squealing faintly as the aircraft settled. The passengers in the cabin had no idea of the silent war fought in the cockpit. No clue that a mistake nearly cost them safe coordination, and that the person who saved them was still treated as an intruder. Stepping out after shutdown, the humiliation clung like smoke. Every slight, every dismissal, every whispered reminder that belonging wasn't decided by skill, but by those already entrenched in power. Yet beneath the sting, something hardened. Resolve thickened like armor. Each insult, each dismissal, each sneer wasn't breaking her. It was forging something stronger. If they thought their hostility would force her out, they had miscalculated. The fight had only just begun. The next days bled into each other like turbulence that refused to smooth out. Each assignment brought the same ritual. No captain's seat, no authority, only shadowing flights where the stripes on her sleeves seemed to mean less with every passing hour. Flight after flight, the names rotated. Peterson, Hall, Ramirez, then Whitmore again. Some captains were openly dismissive, others merely cold. The tone shifted, but the message never did. She wasn't trusted to lead. She was there to watch, as if years of mastery suddenly vanished upon entering Meridian. Each shadow flight was framed as standard procedure, a way to ease into company culture. But the pattern stood out too sharply to be coincidence. Every route was short, low stakes, designed to minimize her presence. The cockpit became a cage, her role reduced to silent observation while men with fewer hours and less experience commanded without question. James Chen remained one of the few willing to acknowledge the truth. Between flights, his words carried quiet frustration. "They're cycling you through all the old guard captains. It's not about training, it's about pressure. They're hoping you'll get tired, maybe even quit." The thought stung, but it also confirmed what instinct had already whispered. This wasn't resistance to inexperience. It was resistance to identity. Support, though rare, began to appear in unexpected corners. On one layover, a flight attendant named Lauren Kim lingered in the galley after passengers had disembarked. She'd watched the way Wilson snapped at her for minor things, the way Peterson ignored her input altogether. "I know what they're doing," Lauren said, her voice low but certain. "Different game, same playbook. They did it to me too, just in another way." Her story poured out in fragments. Years of being passed over for lead flight attendant roles, complaints of harassment brushed aside, male colleagues with less time in the air advancing ahead of her without resistance. "They'll frame it as tradition, as standards," Lauren said. "But it's bias, plain and simple. You're not imagining it." Her words carried the sting of recognition, another reminder that exclusion here wasn't confined to the cockpit. It stretched across uniforms, feeding on silence and survival. Then came Marcus Jefferson, a figure she met in the maintenance hangar while observing pre-flight checks. Marcus had the steady hands of someone who'd worked engines longer than most had been alive. His coveralls carried grease stains like badges of honor, but his eyes carried fatigue. When he realized they shared a Detroit background, his guarded tone softened. The conversation turned personal before slipping into something heavier. 23 years I've been with Meridian, Marcus said, tightening a bolt beneath the wing. I've seen good captains, bad captains, and a whole lot of politics. But what I've seen lately? He shook his head. Different beast altogether. She pressed gently, careful not to push too hard. What do you mean? He glanced around, making sure no supervisors hovered nearby. His voice dropped. Management's been cutting corners. Less turnaround time, fewer checks. On paper it looks fine. They know how to write reports that please inspectors. But me? I wouldn't let my family fly some of these planes. The words hit heavier than Wilson's insults ever had. This wasn't just about prejudice in promotions or assignments. It was about safety, about lives carried across skies in aircraft that weren't being cared for with the diligence they deserved. Marcus didn't linger. He wiped his hands on a rag, giving only a curt nod before walking away, leaving the warning behind like a weight on her shoulders. Standing by the aircraft, watching ground crews swarm around, it became clear the battle wasn't only about proving her right to wear stripes. It was about exposing an entire system built to protect those who wanted her silent, no matter the cost. The pattern had revealed itself, and it was darker than exclusion alone. Now, every flight carried not just the burden of racism, but the possibility of danger written into the very bones of the planes themselves. The warning from Marcus refused to fade. His words lingered like turbulence that wouldn't settle, echoing louder with every new assignment. The issue wasn't only about who got to sit in the captain's seat. It was about the planes themselves and the hidden choices shaping their safety. Late nights in a small Chicago apartment turned into hours of searching through public records, scanning industry bulletins, and digging through articles most employees ignored. What emerged painted a troubling picture of Meridian Airlines, one that stretched far beyond personal bias. FAA reports told the first story. Months earlier, the airline had been flagged for discrepancies in its maintenance logs. The documents were vague, written in careful language, but clear enough. Routine inspections weren't always recorded, and parts replaced on paper didn't always match reality. The official review ended quietly, satisfactorily resolved, yet the timing lined up with Marcus's warning. The paperwork looked clean because it had been designed to. Digging further revealed another pattern. Lawsuits, 3 of them in the past decade, filed by former employees alleging discrimination and hostile work environments. 2 were flight attendants, 1 was a ground crew supervisor. Each case ended the same way. Settled out of court, locked behind non-disclosure agreements. The amounts weren't disclosed, but the silence spoke volumes. Problems weren't solved, they were buried. Even the leadership told its own truth. The company website boasted of its legacy. Photos of executives lined neatly in suits, every face the same. All white, nearly all men. They spoke in interviews of traditions, a word used like armor, shielding decades of exclusion as though it were a badge of honor. Traditions had become the justification for why the same kind of people remained in power, while anyone different was forced to prove themselves 10 times over. Every page, every clipped article added weight to a realization that had been circling since that first order to wait outside. This wasn't simply about an individual career. It wasn't about easing a new captain into the system or protecting standards. It was about preserving a structure built to exclude and protecting profits that mattered more than people. The whispers of corruption weren't whispers anymore. They formed a pattern too sharp to ignore. Each cut corner on maintenance meant fewer delays, fewer costs, and higher numbers for shareholders. Each silenced complaint meant one less obstacle for leadership. The discrimination wasn't an accident, it was part of the machinery, woven into policies, reinforced through silence, disguised as procedure. She leaned back from the laptop, eyes scanning the notes scattered across the desk. Flight hours proved her skill. Past missions proved her resilience. But this fight wasn't about what she could do in the sky. It was about what was being hidden on the ground. The thought carried its own danger. Speaking up about discrimination alone carried risk. being branded difficult, insubordinate, unfit for leadership. But exposing safety violations? That meant going against the very core of the company's reputation. It meant threatening not just careers, but the financial empire built on polished planes and glossy advertising campaigns. The weight of her father's words returned again, twice as good to get half as far. He hadn't warned only about proving skill. He had warned about surviving a system designed to push her out, no matter how much skill existed. This was no longer about one captain being sidelined. It was about an airline willing to gamble with lives to protect its image, hiding bias and danger under the banner of tradition. And as the realization settled in, one question rose louder than the rest. If maintenance was being compromised, what would happen on the day when cost-cutting collided with the unforgiving sky? The assignment came without warning. Captain of a red-eye from Chicago to Las Vegas. On the surface, it looked like a breakthrough. Finally entrusted with command after weeks of shadowing. But the route raised suspicion. It was unpopular, the kind of overnight run no one else wanted, paired with a co-pilot who had already shown loyalty to the company over truth. Still, the chance to sit in the left seat again carried weight. Stepping into the cockpit, she felt the familiar control panels under her hands, the leather of the captain's chair, the hum of readiness in the aircraft systems. For the first time since joining Meridian, the stripes on her sleeves matched the authority of her position. Pre-flight checks began with routine precision, each item ticked against decades of habit. But then, the logbook caught her eye. The entries didn't line up. Maintenance records for the intake valve inspection carried dates that contradicted service reports. One showed completion weeks earlier, while another claimed the task hadn't been performed at all. It was the kind of discrepancy Marcus Jefferson had warned about, minor on paper, dangerous in reality. She paused, flipping through the pages again. The co-pilot shifted in his seat, his voice uneasy. "Captain, we're already pushing close to schedule. Dispatch is asking about our departure window." Her voice stayed calm. Better late than never leaving the ground at all. Stepping out of the cockpit, she requested an extended inspection. Ground crew arrived reluctantly, muttering about the delay, but she stood firm. Every minute stretched heavier under the weight of irritated passengers and mounting pressure from dispatch. The delay grew to 20 minutes before she was satisfied the aircraft was safe to fly. Takeoff finally came. The engines roared, the runway blurred, and the aircraft climbed into the dark sky. To the passengers, it was a routine flight. To her, it was a reminder of how fragile the line was between vigilance and disaster. The flight passed without incident, landing in Las Vegas ahead of schedule thanks to strong tailwinds. But the confrontation waiting back in Chicago carried more turbulence than any storm. The following morning, a summons arrived. Report to the office of Operations Director Thomas Barrett. Barrett sat behind a desk that seemed built more for intimidation than function, papers neatly stacked, expression carved in disapproval. He wasted no time. "Captain, I understand you delayed Flight 889 last night," he said, voice clipped. "Unnecessary inspection. Do you realize the cost? Thousands lost in scheduling adjustments, passenger compensation, and fuel." She stood tall, refusing to shrink into apology. The maintenance logs showed discrepancies that required clarification. "Our ground crew cleared the aircraft," Barrett snapped back. "You overruled them based on what exactly? A hunch?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Based on my training, my 2 decades of flight experience, and FAA regulations that require accurate documentation before departure. The intake valve inspection dates did not align with service records. That isn't a hunch, it's fact." Barrett leaned forward, his voice lowering into a threat disguised as advice. "At Meridian, we value efficiency alongside safety. If you can't trust our procedures, perhaps this isn't the right environment for you." The weight of his words carried more than irritation. It was exclusion sharpened into warning. Know your place or leave it. She let the silence stretch before answering, her voice measured but firm. "Are you asking me to ignore safety violations?" Barrett's face hardened, color rising to his cheeks. "I'm asking you to use better judgment in the future." Her reply came with steady finality. "I always do, and my judgment will always place safety above profit." The meeting ended there, but the lines had been drawn. Barrett's disdain wasn't just professional. It was personal. She had challenged not only his authority, but the system he represented, a system that had no intention of letting her belong, no matter how flawless her record. Walking out of that office, the decision pressed deeper into her resolve. They could call her difficult. They could frame her as a problem. But if protecting lives branded her unfit for Meridian, then the company's real problem wasn't her presence. It was the corruption festering inside its walls. The red-eye flight should have been a victory, proof that skill and judgment could not be denied. Instead, it marked her as a target. From that moment, the stripes on her sleeves no longer represented authority in their eyes. They marked her as difficult. Word spread quickly through Meridian's ranks. Whispers followed in corridors, heads turned in briefing rooms, and schedules shifted in ways too deliberate to be coincidence. Barrett's glare at the meeting had been more than personal disdain. It had been an unspoken order. She was a problem, and problems were to be pushed out. Flights grew shorter, layovers harsher, rest windows tighter. She was reassigned to routes no one else wanted, paired with captains who either ignored her existence or criticized every word she spoke. Even routine communication became a weapon. A request for clarification on procedures was twisted into arrogance. A reminder about FAA requirements was reframed as insubordination. Wilson played his role with particular relish. On one flight, he announced to the crew in front of her, "We follow tradition here, not improvisation." His voice carried just loud enough to draw smirks from others in earshot. Another time, when she corrected a checklist error, he muttered, "Some people just don't know when to stay quiet." Each insult was subtle enough to avoid formal reprimand, but sharp enough to bruise reputation. The playbook was clear. Make her presence unbearable, frame her as disruptive, and let attrition finish the job. But walking away had never been an option. Instead, she opened a second logbook, one not sanctioned by Meridian. In it, every detail found a place: dates, times, remarks, errors ignored, procedures skipped. Every insult and every attempt to sideline her was recorded in neat, unshakable handwriting. What Barrett and Wilson saw as intimidation became evidence. What they framed as tradition became a paper trail. James noticed the weight pressing against her shoulders. During a late layover in Denver, he broke the silence over coffee. "You know you could file a complaint, right? HR, the FAA? Someone has to hear this. You've got grounds." She met his gaze, exhaustion etched into her features, but determination steady. "Not yet." "Not yet?" His voice carried disbelief. "They're grinding you down. Every day they're setting traps. Why wait?" "Because this isn't just about me," she said firmly. "If I file now, they'll brand it as personal grievance, and they'll bury it like the others. I need more. I need the pattern. This is bigger than me." Her words silenced him for a long moment. He knew she was right. Individual complaints had been buried before, paid off, silenced with signatures and settlements. But the quiet fire in her voice revealed something else. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was strategy. Back at headquarters, Barrett and Wilson's partnership grew more obvious. Wilson delivered the daily cuts. Barrett handled the official threats. Together, they drew the boundaries of exclusion with the precision of men who had done it many times before. In their eyes, she wasn't an asset. She was an intruder who had dared to challenge the chain of command. The company itself seemed to close ranks. Meetings about efficiency grew sharper, with subtle warnings about pilots who didn't fit. Training sessions emphasized tradition, as if aimed directly at her. Even flight attendants who once offered warm greetings grew hesitant, sensing the stigma that followed anyone who stood too close. Every corner of Meridian felt like a test, every assignment a trap. Yet each night, as the apartment filled with pages of notes and records, resolve deepened. They wanted her out, but she wasn't leaving. Not when the truth pointed to something much larger than discrimination alone. The stakes weren't just her career. They were about the safety of passengers who trusted Meridian with their lives, and about exposing a system that had survived unchecked for decades. And as she prepared for yet another reassigned flight, the reality became sharper than ever. This wasn't a battle with individual men anymore. It was a fight against the weight of an entire company. For weeks, Naomi had carried the weight alone, careful not to reveal the logbook tucked away in her bag. But isolation had its limits. One night, sitting in a quiet airport diner during another exhausting layover, James leaned across the table and said what she already knew. "You can't fight this on your own." He was right. The company had numbers, influence, lawyers, and decades of precedent on its side. She had skill, determination, and now, finally, allies who understood the cost of silence. The coalition began quietly. James, with his steady loyalty in the cockpit, became her first anchor. He offered more than moral support. His knowledge of procedures, scheduling quirks, and the inner politics of the pilot corps filled in pieces of the puzzle she couldn't reach alone. Where Naomi saw open hostility, James traced the mechanics of how assignments were shifted, how captains were paired, how paperwork was filed to make bias look like coincidence. Then came Lauren Kim. Naomi had flown with her before, a flight attendant with the calm strength of someone who had weathered storms of her own. In the galley one evening, after Wilson made yet another condescending remark, Lauren lingered. "It's not just you," she whispered. "They tried the same with me." Over coffee, Lauren revealed her own story. Years earlier, she had reported harassment by a senior purser. Explicit comments, inappropriate touches, threats disguised as jokes. HR had promised an investigation. Instead, she was quietly reassigned, then pressured to sign paperwork acknowledging a misunderstanding. The purser remained, promoted even, while Lauren was reminded to focus on her duties. Her words carried a familiar bitterness. "They make it clear, we're expendable. As long as we stay quiet, the machine keeps running." Lauren's experience mirrored Naomi's in painful detail. The dismissals, the forced silence, the rewriting of events to protect the company. But her willingness to speak now gave Naomi something more valuable than sympathy: corroboration. Marcus Jefferson was the final piece. A veteran mechanic, he carried the quiet resignation of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. When Naomi approached him cautiously in the hangar one night, he didn't hesitate. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," he said. From a locked drawer in his workshop, Marcus produced documents, maintenance schedules, work orders, inspection sheets. They told a damning story. Checks marked as complete in half the scheduled time. Signatures of junior mechanics listed on forms they never touched. And worst of all, directives from supervisors instructing crews to sign off on repairs without actually performing them, all under the guise of efficiency. "They call it streamlining," Marcus explained, voice low. "But what it means is planes flying without proper checks. Pressure comes from the top. We're told delays hurt the brand, and anyone who resists doesn't understand the business." His eyes hardened. "I wouldn't let my family on some of these flights, not anymore." Naomi felt the ground shift beneath her. It wasn't just bias that kept her on the margins. It was an entire system designed to protect profits at the expense of truth, with discrimination serving as both weapon and shield. Her treatment was part of the same machinery that silenced Lauren, that cornered Marcus, that sought to bury her beneath Wilson's smirks and Barrett's threats. As the three of them spoke, connections formed. James supplied the map of how pilots were rotated, Lauren highlighted the way HR neutralized complaints, and Marcus exposed the physical danger beneath it all. Together, the pieces formed a picture no longer deniable. Meridian Airlines wasn't simply hostile. It was dangerous. The truth seared in Naomi's chest. This wasn't about her seat in the cockpit anymore. It wasn't about earning respect from men who had no intention of giving it. It was about the lives of passengers who stepped on board believing safety was guaranteed. She looked at her allies, James with his quiet resolve, Lauren with her guarded courage, Marcus with his weary defiance. They weren't just colleagues anymore. They were the beginnings of something stronger. For the first time since stepping into the crew lounge weeks earlier, Naomi felt clarity. She wouldn't limit herself to surviving. She wouldn't fight just to hold on to her career. She would expose everything. The decision crystallized in a single, unshakable thought. She wasn't going to protect herself. She was going to bring the entire airline down. Once the decision was made, the course became clear. Survival wasn't enough. If Meridian wanted her silenced, then the only way forward was through the truth, and the truth had to be recorded. Every flight became an operation within an operation. Logbooks were no longer just paperwork. They were potential evidence. While captains strutted through their checklists and ground crews hurried to meet impossible deadlines, she carried a phone tucked discreetly into her jacket pocket, snapping photographs of maintenance pages whenever eyes turned away. Dates, signatures, missing entries. Each image captured another crack in the facade the airline worked so hard to polish. Sometimes it was easy. A quiet corner of the hangar, an unattended clipboard, a moment when supervisors barked orders in the opposite direction. Other times, it required timing as delicate as flying through crosswinds, pretending to stretch while the shutter clicked, pretending to check her bag while a page flipped open. Each photo carried the risk of discovery, and discovery meant more than embarrassment. It meant the end. Marcus Jefferson knew the stakes better than anyone. One evening, after a shift that dragged past midnight, he cornered her near the service bay. His eyes carried the urgency of a man who had already seen too many colleagues ruined for speaking too loudly. "If they catch you," he said flatly, "you'll never fly again. You'll be branded as trouble, and they'll make sure no airline in the country touches your name." The warning pressed heavy, but her reply came with calm defiance, better grounded with integrity than flying on lies. Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding, half in respect, half in fear. "Then watch yourself. They protect their secrets with teeth." The first hints that those teeth were already closing in came days later. Her apartment, once a refuge, began to feel compromised. Small details raised alarms. The faint shift of a chair she knew she hadn't moved, the subtle misplacement of papers on her desk. A call came through on her personal phone, the line filled not with a voice, but with static. When she answered, silence lingered for a beat too long before the click of disconnection. At first, she dismissed them as nerves, but the signs multiplied. A car idled across the street for hours, driver obscured by the reflection of the windshield. In the terminal, she noticed the same maintenance supervisor lingering near the gate, even when he wasn't scheduled to work. What began as suspicion thickened into certainty. Someone was watching. Paranoia pressed closer with every step. She began checking locks twice, then 3 times. She stopped turning lights on at night, choosing instead to sit in the quiet glow of her laptop, cataloging evidence under the cover of darkness. Every keystroke felt like it carried weight, each folder on her hard drive a lifeline tethering her to the truth. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't only about discrimination. It was about survival. Not just of a career, but of reputation, safety, and perhaps even more. The company wasn't going to let someone like her dismantle decades of power without a fight. And the first blows had already been thrown, subtle and sharp, designed to break her resolve before it reached the surface. Yet fear only sharpened determination. If they wanted her intimidated, they had chosen the wrong target. Each strange call, each watchful eye across the street, each muttered slight in a briefing room only convinced her further. Because now, it was no longer just about the truth hidden in those maintenance logs. It was about exposing the people who thought intimidation could erase accountability. The notes on her desk grew thicker, photographs stacked higher, testimony from allies more precise. What began as a personal fight for dignity had become a dossier strong enough to bring an airline to its knees. And as she locked the final folder into a drawer that night, the phone rang again, its shrill echo cutting through the silence. This time, when she answered, a voice finally spoke. Low, measured, unmistakably threatening. "We know what you're doing." The assignment looked like a turning point. After weeks of shadowing and red eyes, she was finally scheduled to command a long-haul international flight from Chicago to London. The route was prestigious, the kind that demanded trust, the kind new captains rarely saw so soon. To outsiders, it might have looked like Meridian was rewarding her. To those inside, it was something else, a test. The crew gathered at the gate with the usual hum of preparation. Flight attendants arranged service lists, the co-pilot checked fuel calculations, and passengers filed into the terminal waiting area with luggage in tow. Every element moved with routine precision, except for the weight pressing against the maintenance log in her hand. The log carried a notation, small, almost hidden in technical jargon, that flagged an engine sensor issue. The note said it had been cleared. The initials belonged to a supervisor known for signing off without a second glance. Cross-checking the reports revealed no follow-up inspection. The entry was buried, disguised as a resolved detail. The decision struck hard and fast. A captain's authority was absolute when it came to safety, and she would not gamble with lives to satisfy schedules. She closed the binder, voice steady as she called for the aircraft to remain grounded. The announcement rippled quickly. Gate agents frowned as departure times flashed red. Passengers grew restless, checking watches, shifting in their seats. Whispers of delay became groans of frustration, then sharp complaints. Inside the operations office, voices sharpened. "What do you mean she won't take off?" a manager demanded over the radio. Her reply cut through firmly. "This aircraft has unresolved maintenance discrepancies. We're not leaving this gate until the issue is properly addressed." The co-pilot shifted nervously, caught between protocol and fear of reprisal. "Captain, dispatch is escalating." She met his eyes. "Safety is not negotiable." An hour passed. The gate buzzed with tension, passengers demanding explanations, phones lifted to record angry videos. Airline staff muttered about compensation, about reputational damage. Finally, Thomas Barrett appeared, face red, voice clipped with fury. "You've cost us hundreds of thousands already," he snapped. "Passengers are threatening lawsuits. Do you have any idea what you've done?" She held her ground. "I prevented an unsafe aircraft from leaving this airport. If you want to argue profit over safety, you can do it without me." Barrett's jaw tightened. His glare carried both rage and recognition. That defiance like this could not be dismissed quietly. The confrontation might have ended behind closed doors, if not for what came next. A reporter for a local station had been traveling on the flight, watching events unfold from the gate. By the time Barrett stormed off, the headline was already being written. "Meridian's star, new black pilot, delays international flight over safety dispute." By morning, the story was everywhere. Footage from passengers, clips of arguments at the gate, statements of frustration. All laced with the undertone that the decision-maker was both new to the airline and visibly different from the captains who normally graced its advertisements. Some painted her as overcautious, others as heroic. But all agreed, this wasn't business as usual. Public attention ignited like wildfire. Talk shows debated her decision. Aviation blogs dissected the log entries she had flagged. Civil rights voices weighed in, pointing out the double standard. How many white male captains had delayed flights for less, without becoming headlines? Her name spread farther than any flight plan ever had, no longer just a pilot, but a symbol of defiance. In the center of it all, she sat alone in her apartment, the glow of the television reflecting the chaos she had unleashed. This was the moment she had tried to avoid, the moment that erased any chance of quietly collecting evidence. There was no going back. Not after grounding a major international flight. Not after headlines turned her into both target and torchbearer. She knew the airline would fight with everything it had, and she knew she would have to fight harder. The summons came within hours of the story breaking. A single line on her phone screen, "Report to my office immediately." No signature was necessary. Everyone knew whose authority carried that tone. Thomas Barrett's office sat at the top of Meridian's glass headquarters, a space designed to intimidate. The walls were lined with awards for excellence in service, photographs of aircraft gleaming under blue skies, and plaques celebrating decades of tradition. Yet the man behind the desk was anything but polished. Barrett's face was red with fury, his jaw tight as if bracing against the humiliation that had already begun spreading through the press. He didn't waste a breath on greetings. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he snapped, slamming a file onto the desk. "You grounded an international flight without justification. Do you know the cost of that delay? The lawsuits? The headlines? You've made this company a laughingstock." Her stance remained steady, shoulders squared, eyes calm. "I grounded an unsafe aircraft. The justification is in your own records." Barrett's voice grew sharper, slicing through the air. "You've ended your career. Do you understand that? You'll never sit in a cockpit again. Every airline in this country will know your name, and not as a pilot, as a liability. You'll lose your license, your pension, your reputation. And when I'm finished, you'll be lucky to find work on a tarmac." Each threat came louder, but she refused to flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Setting it on the desk, she slid it forward with deliberate calm. Inside were copies of maintenance logs, Pages marked with discrepancies, signatures that didn't match, inspections marked complete in impossibly short timeframes. Beneath them lay Marcus Jefferson's statements, written by hand, naming supervisors who pressured technicians to falsify documents. Alongside were notes from crew members, Lauren's among them, describing harassment dismissed by HR and safety complaints ignored. Barrett froze. His bluster faltered as his eyes scanned the first pages. The evidence was undeniable, too detailed, too extensive to dismiss as coincidence. His fingers tightened against the paper, but the anger in his face shifted to something else, recognition. He had underestimated her. This, his voice caught, then steadied into a growl. This is stolen company property. No, she replied evenly. This is proof. Proof that Meridian isn't just hostile to women and minorities. It's hostile to safety itself. Proof that lives are at risk because tradition matters more to you than accountability. He tried to muster authority again, but his voice cracked under the weight of the folder. If this gets out, you'll go down with us. Do you really think the FAA or the press will see you as a hero? You'll be painted as disgruntled, unstable. They'll say you fabricated it all. Her eyes didn't waver. Let them try. I've spent my entire life proving I belong where you swore I never would. You told me to wait outside. Now I'm walking through the front door, with the FAA. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. For the first time, Barrett didn't look like the untouchable executive who ruled with intimidation. He looked like a man cornered, realizing too late that the walls he built to keep others out now trapped him inside. She gathered the folder, tucking it back into her bag with calm precision. Turning to leave, she didn't wait for permission. The authority in the room had shifted, and Barrett knew it. As the door closed behind her, his voice didn't follow. He had nothing left to say. The battle was no longer in Meridian's hallways. It was heading for the public stage, where tradition could no longer hide behind closed doors. The storm came swiftly once the evidence was released. The FAA launched a full-scale investigation, combing through maintenance records that could no longer be hidden behind polished reports and corporate language. Each falsified signature, each incomplete inspection, each silenced complaint formed a trail that led straight to Meridian's highest offices. Executives who once dismissed her as difficult were summoned into hearings they could not escape. Barrett, Wilson, and others who prided themselves on guarding tradition now found themselves defending the indefensible. Some resigned quietly, others were forced out. Their reputations, once untouchable, crumbled under the weight of documents they swore would never see daylight. The fines were staggering. Millions paid out to regulators, settlements with employees who had endured harassment and discrimination, mandatory reforms demanded by federal oversight. For an airline that had branded itself as one of the nation's most trusted carriers, the stain could not be polished away. Passengers asked hard questions. Civil rights groups amplified the story. Safety advocates demanded accountability. The machine that thrived on silence had been cracked open for the world to see. For her, the cost was steep. Her name spread across headlines, debated on talk shows, dissected in aviation forums. Some hailed her as a hero, others branded her reckless, unfit, a woman who put herself above the company. Job offers did not flood in. Airlines hesitated, wary of hiring someone who had brought down an entire operation with truth. Her career, once her greatest pride, stood on the edge of ruin. And yet, the legacy she carried was bigger than any single route or cockpit assignment. She had become a symbol of what it meant to resist exclusion, to fight for integrity, even when it meant losing everything. In interviews, she spoke not of vengeance but of preparation. They thought waiting outside meant exclusion. To me, it meant preparation. Every slight, every dismissal, every insult was training for the day I had to stand alone. Her words struck deeper than the fines or the resignations. They reached those who had been told to wait outside in their own ways. Women denied promotions, workers silenced for speaking up, passengers who questioned whether their safety mattered less than profit. The story's aftermath proved one truth. Change never comes without cost. But silence carries a cost far greater. And now the question rests with those listening. Would you have spoken up, knowing it could end your career? Have you ever witnessed injustice and wondered if your voice would make a difference? This story is not just about aviation. It is about every workplace, every institution, every closed door where someone is told they don't belong. If you've lived through moments like this, share your story in the comments. Let your voice be part of the record no one can erase. And if you believe no one should ever be told to wait outside because of race or gender, like this video and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Together, every story told chips away at the walls built to keep people silent. And sometimes, the simple act of speaking becomes the loudest flight path of all.